the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Ruth Lue-Quee, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an educational consultant, aka my mummy teacher, founder of MMT Pay, and passionate about play and inclusion. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting SEN in the early years, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. I'm delighted to introduce Andre Imich as today's guest.
Good morning, Ruth, and thank you for that introduction. I'm an educational psychologist by background, but I've also been a teacher in primary and secondary schools. I've managed services in local authorities, including early years services. And more recently, I've been the Special Educational Needs and Disability Professional Advisor in the Department for Education. Throughout my career, early years has been a really important part of my sort of role and my interest. And I've particularly enjoyed, back in the day when I was an educational psychologist, visiting families at home, seeing children learning to develop and play together, visiting play groups, running some training courses in the early years sector. So I'm really pleased you've invited me to be here today, Ruth. Thank you.
Amazing. We are in safe hands, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. In this episode, we're going to be covering the topic of identifying SEN in early years with practical guidance for practitioners that hopefully they'll be able to take away and support them to identify potential SEN in young children. So I wanted to start off by having a little talk about the key developmental milestones which can be affected by SEN. So obviously we have our developmental domains, our motor skills, speech and language, social and emotive and cognitive skills. But what are those key developmental milestones that we should really be looking within the domains that could potentially indicate that a child has got a special educational need?
I think for children's development, every aspect is really important, isn't it? Because ultimately we're looking for the whole child and the whole development. So any aspect of those developmental profiles that you've been talking about that seems to be out of kilter is something that we need to pay attention to. That doesn't mean that it's an indicator of special educational needs, because children develop at different rates at different ages compared to their peers. But each of those developmental profiles are equally important. We couldn't say that one was more important than the other. We know that in terms of the education system, what we're ultimately trying to do is prepare children and young people for life after education, so that they're independent, they're prepared well for independence and adulthood. So being able to communicate with other people is vital, isn't it? Being able to socialize and have personal interactions with other people is vital to future sort of social happiness and integration in society. Speech and language has become a growing area of special educational needs. And that reflects both our recognition of its importance, but also, I think, improved assessment and understanding of delays. So I think that, for me, is a really important one. And speech and language development is something that our early years providers, through the early years foundation stages, focus on considerably. It's also an area that there's lots of identification of children's special educational needs at the moment. And some might put that down in recent times to the impact of the pandemic, where young children did not have the same sort of developmental opportunities as their predecessors and as children today, where, in other words, they were at home with limited access to social interaction and communication with others of their same age, or indeed with adults.
Mm-hmm. So this is my personal opinion here. I think quite often what can happen with our children is, as you briefly touched upon, we've got our assessments, we've got our early learning goals where we're aiming for our children to be, and these are created as sort of a national benchmark that we're aiming for. But I'm sure we can agree that obviously child development does not completely work like that. So then I sometimes wonder if actually what we're doing is missing out some of the prerequisite skills that children really, really need to develop and master in favour of trying to get them to reach this
Mm.
benchmark standard that perhaps isn't quite developmentally appropriate for them. And then this can be where this sort of mismatch comes between, is this a child with a special educational need, or is it just a case actually that developmentally they haven't quite met the developmental milestones that they need to. They've been perhaps rushed through them, or they just haven't had that time to master it before being pushed on to be somewhere they shouldn't quite be yet for that individual. What are your thoughts around that?
Yes, I mean, there's a fine line, isn't there, between sort of helping children along in terms of what the expectations are of most or all, and then being worried when they don't follow that sequentially, and allowing for the individual development and variation and so on. And that is a fine line. And I think it can, in some instances, become a real pressure. And I think it's something we need to keep reminding ourselves that childhood is meant to be an enjoyable experience for all, and we want to make it fun and so on. And putting pressure on to achieve step by step incremental developmental milestones can take away the sort of joy of childhood and lead others to be very, very worried about the child, when actually given time and care and love and so on, they will make good progress, or, satisfactory progress. So I think there is that difficult balance there, isn't it? Achieving milestones whilst also having a good childhood.
Absolutely. I mean, I am one of the champions of childhood and play, and believing that that is
Mm.
what children need and children need best. And personally, I feel like we should be promoting that well into key stage one, if not
Yeah.
beyond, and because that is how children do learn best. And I feel like perhaps if children were having more of that continuous provision that we get so right in early years, right through primary school and beyond, perhaps would that support our children? Well, it would support all children, wouldn't it? But in
Mm.
particular, those children with SEN and special needs, to really, really be able to adapt the curriculum and be able to master those things themselves. Going to move on slightly into having a little think about some of the observable indicators that we might be able to spot. So, what should we be looking for? So this one is really identifying SEN in early years. What should we be looking for in terms of communication, the potential SEN in young children?
Well, interesting. Psychologists will say that if we talk about communication, about 80% of how we communicate is non-verbally and 20% is verbally. So it's really very important to think about the whole child's communication development, and think about how the child is engaging in eye contact with other people who are speaking to them, or who are close to them. So what are the issues around eye contact? How well is the child listening and sort of taking in what's going on around them? That's a really important aspect. And communication, I often think communication and social development are closely linked. So seeing how children play with each other, how they take turns, etc., etc. That's all part of speech and language development. It all comes together nicely, or not always so nicely. So picking up a child, a child who's playing on their own might be an indication of some issues. It might not be, but it's a warning sign that we need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
And children whose speech isn't clear enough, who aren't getting their messages across, ultimately they can become quite frustrated and develop sort of behaviour issues because they're frustrated at not being understood by others. So perhaps sort of a child who loses their temper quite easily, it could be a sign that they're struggling with their communication and are frustrated that other people can't understand them easily, rather than anything else. Again, another indicator perhaps of a speech and language developmental difficulty.
Mhm.
So we need to keep on thinking about all the aspects that contribute to a particular area of development.
I think what you've mentioned there as well, which would be a really good tip to provide to practitioners that are listening to this when it comes to speech and language, and those sorts of social skills, is that we can often say too much as adults. And quite
Yes,
often it's so important for us to strip things back. And I always use the example of a pencil being on a table. And if I want the pencil off the table, I'll probably go, "Oh, could you pass me the pencil, please?" to the
exactly.
child. Actually, all we need to do is think about our cues, essentially, that we use for these really, really young children that even are perhaps struggling with their communication. Let's strip it right back. We can point, we can say pencil, and we can offer please, or
Yeah.
we can use Makaton, or whatever it is you're doing within your setting. Strip it back. And I think that's a really good way to sort of support those children with those speech and language barriers that they may
Mm.
face as well. What about, would you say, for physical development? What are the sorts of observable indicators of SEN in terms of physical development?
Well, I mean, I think firstly, newborns have good assessment of their physical development right at the beginning. So um, the most complex physical development issues are usually picked up at birth. But of course, there will be some that are missed. Then there will be some with who aren't that severe, but who will require additional support because their physical development is sort of different. Watching children at play, watching their fine motor skills, how they pick up small items and so on, how they run, how they move, all of those issues are really important. And of course, one of the most important things that early years practitioners need to do is listen to parents. And I mean, it is true that parents know their children best, and they will understand where they think their child is not progressing as well as they might. So when parents talk about their children's and their worries, practitioners need to take them seriously. And parents will have experience of, if they don't have other children themselves, they'll usually be interacting with other families with children of similar ages and can see that physical development of their child isn't quite keeping up with the rate that other children are. When they talk to a practitioner about that, it needs to be taken seriously and looked at carefully.
Mhm. Absolutely, and I think you've hit the nail on the head really there. That from birth, a lot of things are identified really well, but parents do know their children, and you have that gut inside of you, don't you?
Yeah.
That if we can have those conversations going, and also sometimes a parent won't have realised that there could be that this child is developmentally working below expected because they've got nothing to compare it to. So sometimes it is a case of the
Mm,
practitioner having that first conversation, but then the parents go, "Oh yeah, and I noticed this at
mm,
home, this at home, this at home." But if you've never approached them and had that conversation,
no,
and actually, I actually think within early years, you guys have got one of the hardest jobs ever because you're the first person that's probably ever had this conversation. So some
yes.
parents could go the other way. They could be like, "What are you saying about my child?" So it really is quite a skill to be able to have this professional dialogue and have this conversation where you've built up that trust that the parent feels open enough to come to you, but equally where you can celebrate achievements and wonderful things about this child, but also any concerns that you might have,
Mm,
so that collectively you can give them the best support that they will absolutely need to have. And we did touch upon briefly about behaviour. And I
yeah.
think it's really key that one of the things that I always believe is that behaviour, it's children don't want to be, I'm going to put this in inverted commas, they don't want to be naughty children. Like, no child wants to be that. If a child is displaying a certain behaviour, it's because a certain need is not met. So it's our
Yeah.
job as practitioners to ensure that we are meeting their needs. And the need could be a million and one other things. It could be that this
Mm,
child has come to school and they haven't had breakfast and they're just really hungry and they're a little bit grumpy
Yeah.
and they've had a bad day. It could be that that child's coming to their early years setting and actually they've just heard mum and dad have a really big argument and their whole
Mm.
world's just gone upside down. It could be something as simple as they went to get dressed and the socks that they had on that day
Absolutely.
really itched them and made them have this sensory sensation that they're not used to. But now they've got to go into be dropped up at their childminders and everything's gone.
Yeah.
And there's always a reason. But how do we decipher what is more of a concern, sort of long term, and what is actually this is just a behavioural problem for now, and we're going
Yeah.
to be able to do something to support this child? What would you say with regards to that?
Well, it's certainly sort of taking evidence over a long period of time. And um, early years settings are expected to have in place a system for identifying, assessing, and supporting children called, well, we call it the sort of assess, plan, do, and review cycle. And I think that's a sort of way of trying to keep an eye on a child's development over a period of time, intervening, seeing what difference it makes, and then ultimately over time trying to sort of pick out what are the particular underlying issues that need focus. But assess, plan, do, review is a very sort of thorough system that is used in schools and in early years settings. Just one other role that I think makes a really important contribution or has the potential to do so. I don't think it's always used as well as it can, but that's the role of the health visitor, who we're meant to have 2.5-year developmental profiles and checks on every 2.5-year-old. And that's really critical information at a moment in time that's sort of very important in the early years. That information can help really unpick all sorts of issues that parents might be worried about or others might be worried about, and then used to inform the early years setting of what should be the priority focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that takes us in really nicely to our next point to discuss around that importance of early intervention and the impact
Yeah.
that has on child development. Because, as we've mentioned in our last episode, child development doesn't simply unfold with neurological maturation, but it is shaped by those
Yeah.
biological and those environmental factors around us. So how important is it, if I know when we went through the pandemic that those children have just started school this year. So my little boy is one of those little boys that was a COVID baby who has just started school this year. And our first health visitor appointment was on the phone, as it was for many people. Now, for
Yeah.
me, I was a very conscious parent and I rung the health visitors and I was like, I know he's meant to have a check and he hasn't had one, and they did it over the phone. But for many children, that wouldn't have even been a thing that went into parents' minds, because if you don't really
No.
know about that sort of stuff, you're absolutely not ever going to think about that sort of stuff. And so what is that? What is the importance of early intervention, and how does that impact our children's development?
Yes, I mean, I think early identification and intervention are critical. I mean, we often associate that just with the early years, but I think actually early assessment and intervention can occur at any age of a child. It's when a particular worry is forming or particular issue is developing. So that could be at the age of 12 that a particular challenge is noticed, and then early assessment and intervention is important. But obviously, the earlier we get into an issue, the more likely we are to have success at helping manage that, overcome that, remove barriers, and so on. So it is important that all practitioners are alert to the developmental profiles of early years children, talk to parents, talk to each other. It can't be understated how important that is. And of course, like speech and language, for example, children who have been alone because of the pandemic and not developed, just getting in early, making sure they have lots of social interaction and communication, lots of opportunities for it, often guided by adults, is really critical and can sort of overcome those early delays.
And I think what we've touched upon as well briefly is, as a practitioner, your knowledge of child development is really, really key. So having a
Absolutely.
look at that, because that is not going to only shape and inform your practice, but that is going to place you in the best position to be able to support all of these children,
Yeah.
and support them with their early intervention as well. So a bit of a sort of how to, I guess. If a practitioner or a teacher thinks that a child, or it could be a very young, a toddler, has SEN, what should they do? What would your top tip be?
Well, the first thing, which is hopefully very obvious, but I think it's worth saying, is talk to the parent if they haven't already, or if the parent hasn't been the one that's brought it to their attention. But if a practitioner feels that a child's development profile isn't what it should be, talk to the parent first. Then I would say they should be putting in place measures such as assess, plan, do, review. But after time, um, sort of working with the family to seek an appropriate additional sort of professional advice. And again, there's all sorts of appropriate agencies depending on the nature of the presenting issue. So, we have speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, etc., special local authorities have specialist teachers that can provide advice and help prepare for school. So it really depends on the sort of nature of the presenting worry or delay. But inaction should not be an option.
Absolutely. And we want to have that child's best interests at heart. And so speaking
Yeah.
with the family and then following steps that the family are in agreement with, and you also know as a professional that's going to help them, and seek further advice and seek further support. Do not be afraid to send
Mm.
emails to your local authority, to speak to your SENCO, to ask the questions, to get the right support for the children that you've got.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great place to end this discussion. So if I was to summarise in one sentence how we can sort of identify SEN in the early years, what to look for, it really is to know your child development and to make sure that you're getting in early, and with those children,
Mm.
identifying what needs they may have as early as you possibly can. I would like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Andre, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Ruth Lue-Quee, and Andre Imich. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.